Hello, my name is Ann Lawrence. I'm the 7th grade CTL, and this is the presentation for Unit 2 and all the things you need to know to have your scholars be successful in this unit. First, I want to start off by going through a quick scenario. I want you to imagine that you're at the State Fair of Texas. And being that this unit is about cells, I want you to think about this. In the State Fair of Texas, what would the mitochondria be? Who's providing us with the energy? Who are the lysosomes? Who's cleaning up things? Who's the chloroplast? Who's creating the food? Who's the nucleus? Who's in control of it all? What would the cell wall be at the State Fair of Texas? And who's in charge of transportation? Who's the vesicle? What did you come up with? Here's what I came up with. I think the mitochondria would be the electricity that runs throughout the park. I think the lysosomes would be the janitorial staff that picks up after all the thousands of visitors. I think chloroplast would be all the fried food stands. I think the nucleus might be Big Tex himself. The cell wall would be the Fair Park gates or the roads around Fair Park. And the vesicles might be the roller coasters. I think this unit has so many opportunities for students to be creative and to make connections across all domains in all subject areas. So let's dive into the content. I'm going to go through priorities for CA number 1 because cells is the second half of CA number 1. I'm going to go through the order of objectives and the unit plan, go through key common misconceptions, go through the project that I've laid out for this unit, the couple of experiments and review games that we're going to have in front of kids, and lastly go through the end goals for Unit 2. Let's get started. So CA number 1, if you recall from my first unit preview, is a majority work problems. However, there are a few problems regarding cells on the first CA in the multiple choice section, and those generally fall into two categories. Either it's a question like on the left where they have to match structure and function or look at a picture and label, or it's this longer situation. There are two of these on this first CA where students read a small paragraph about some kind of malfunction and they determine, or some kind of function, and determine what organelle matches the situation. So in all, our focus for the cells unit is to make sure all students know structure and function of all cell organelles and that they can pick out information from text and determine what organelle matches the situation. That being said, let's look at the Unit 2 plan. This is very, very similar to how I organized it last year. In general, our statement of inquiry for this unit is health of a system is often dependent on maintaining balance. That being said, students really need to recognize that all of the moving parts within the cell are required to keep or maintain homeostasis. So this statement of inquiry can really is very broad and can go through any kind of domain, any kind of subject area. Systems depend on their parts and the parts maintaining functionality in order to keep balance of whatever the end goal of that system is. In our case, we're talking about mitochondria, lysosomes, nucleus, all working in conjunction with one another in order to maintain the balance of a human cell, or any cell really, an organism cell. But that can go along with anything, so all the parts or all the branches of government have to be working in conjunction with each other in order to maintain balance in the U.S. government, for instance. Students will be assessed again in two ways. I have uploaded an MYP assessment for Unit 2, as well as there is a project, which I'll go into more detail later. In general, there are multiple options that people usually do for this unit for cells. Some teachers choose to do cell cakes, where students use different materials and ingredients to create a cake that's representative of either an animal or a plant cell. Some teachers choose to have students build it in a 3D model out of foam or Play-Doh, and then some other teachers do the one that I'm going to talk about, which is making a larger analogy, kind of like the State Fair of Texas analogy that I made at the very beginning of this video. And that's what I'll talk about later. In general, they'll be creating a model of a cell, and the MYP criteria that you'll use to evaluate them is on the unit plan as well. This unit project, in theory, is supposed to really connect with the statement of inquiry so that they can make connections between systems of the cell and systems out there in the world, kind of like the State Fair of Texas system. So let's go through the objectives. If you'll notice, I start with cell theory, which some people kind of brush to the wayside because it doesn't really show up on CA number 1. However, it does show up many, many times on further CAs and assessments that are out there. So don't ignore the cell theory. I start with that. I apologize that all these say number 2, 3, and 4. I'll fix that. And then we move on to different parts of the cell. All those cell parts that I put before the CA are the ones that show up on the CA, so it's really important that you prioritize these first so that they have all the information they need to know before CA1 hits. Golgi, apparatus, lysosome, vacuole, and vesicle don't show up on the CA, or at least they can figure out the answer to a question without having learned these explicitly. So if you have to push those to after CA, like I will probably have to, that is fine. Again, the same thing with homeostasis. Homeostasis shows up on later CAs, not on CA number 1. I have chosen to put the cell project as an in-class project. However, if you're doing a cake model or you're doing a 3D model, this is totally a project that can be sent home with students with various check-ins. Okay, next, misconceptions. There's not as many with this. The very first thing that I mentioned is importance of recall practice. If students miss a problem regarding cells, it probably isn't because they're confused, it's probably because they literally just forgot. So the importance of having students practice remembering all of these cell parts is incredibly important. Students frequently get vesicle and vacuole confused just because they both start with the letter V. Students get very confused with the idea of what protein is. A lot of students identify protein with dairy products or meat products, and while that's maybe accurate, it's not the kind of protein function that we're talking about in cells, so it's really important to make that distinction. So when students read about ribosomes creating protein, they don't think, oh, ribosomes make protein, which is energy, because I eat protein when I eat meat or eggs. So protein function and the function that we talk about in this particular class is very important to make clear to scholars. Lastly, students frequently get confused between chloroplast and mitochondria, since both of them involve creating or using glucose or sugar, or sometimes people just call it food. They flip-flop these all the time. In general, for each cell organelle, and I lay this out in my cell organelles AML, or annotated model lesson, I do a plethora of things for every single cell part so that students have multiple opportunities to remember it. We make flashcards, we make hashtags based on the function, we make a hand gesture, we draw a picture, and we play lots and lots of review games that I'll get into later. Let's talk about the Unit 2 project in more specific detail. Here is the situation that I've set up for students so they have a more specific purpose for creating this deliverable. Katie is having difficulty remembering all the cell organelles and their functions. The test is tomorrow and she needs your help to find new exciting study materials. In order to help Katie, you decide to make an unlabeled cell model which she can use to quiz herself. You make an answer key as well so she can check her answers as she studies. So in general, students are going to create some kind of model that only has like numbers on it. So let's say that they create the model of the State Fair of Texas and Big Tex is the nucleus. Instead of writing next to Big Tex nucleus, they're going to put a number 1, and then on a separate document on what I'm calling the answer key, they'll put number 1, Big Tex equals nucleus. That way, on the day that students present these, we can do sort of a rotation and students can sit in front of someone else's project and quiz themselves, kind of like Katie would in this particular situation. So here's what is required of them. The cell system analogy graphic, big picture, it could be printed, it could be made electronically, it could be drawn. I'll show some examples in a second. There needs to be 10 locations or things that are numbered. So one thing would be Big Tex or nucleus. That would be one location or one thing that would be numbered representing a different organelle. It needs to represent either a plant or animal cell, and the organelles that they choose to represent need to be appropriate for the cell type, meaning if they're doing my example, the State Fair of Texas, if they label the food stands, the fried food stands, as chloroplast, then they have to make sure that they also include a cell wall. Otherwise, it wouldn't be appropriate for the cell type, which in this case would be a plant cell. And then the answer key includes the organelles that match with each location, so it's kind of like a cheat sheet for what their project is. And then they also are required to write down a description of how the analogy works, like how does the piece of the town or piece of the location relate to the organelle. Here's one example. This is a high school example. This is an unclear but good picture of a city, relating parts of a cell to a city. And here's another example. So unlike these, this one says City Hall and nucleus. Our projects would say City Hall and then like a number 1. The nucleus, or the information about what the City Hall represents, would be on a separate piece of paper. That way, the day that students present this, they can sit down and say City Hall. I wonder what that would be, and then look on the answer key to check themselves. Here's how I have students choose or kind of plan out their project. I have them choose some kind of system that could be, and I give a couple of examples, so that it could be a town, it could be the state fair, it could be a computer, it could be the human body, some kind of system in our environment. Next, they choose plant or animal cell, and they determine which of the organelles they plan to represent. They create the answer key, and then they create the model. I have all of this happening in a class period. They likely will not finish, so it will become homework to be turned in at a later date. You can do all of this outside of class. I'm choosing to do some of it in class just so I can make sure that students are having a good start to their project. Okay, next thing is experiment setup and shopping list. There are not a bunch of big experiments in this unit simply because cells are very small. It's hard to represent them. I would suggest, if you have access to microscopes, getting students real live examples of cells, like where they can actually see it through a microscope. That would be great. I do not have those resources available to me, so I chose to do other things. The first one is the cell wall and membrane lab. This one is outlined in my AML. This requires students comparing the parts of a cell, cell wall, membrane, and cytoplasm to an egg, in which case you have to dip a whole bunch of eggs in vinegar so it disintegrates the shell so they can see the membrane underneath. More information about that is in my 5-step AML for cell organelles, uploaded onto Blackboard. The other thing I want to talk about was review games. So a majority of the practice problems or practice that we do in the class during this unit is more like review games. One of them is I have a big blow-up dice and I throw it around the room, and whatever number it lands on is what we fill in the blank. For instance, let's say we're doing letter A, problem number A, and I roll the dice and I get number 2. If a cell were missing number 2, which in this case is the chloroplast, then. So if a cell were missing a chloroplast, then, and then students will fill in the answer to that question. And then so on and so forth. So this you can do as a class, or you can give all the students their own die and have them flip for themselves. I have one activity where students build a cell out of Play-Doh. This requires you buy Play-Doh, so that's another material to consider. You could do it out of clay or really anything else, or you can just have them draw a bunch of pictures, also an option. This down here is another review game that we play. This we use for students kind of working in pairs. So I'll put up a problem that says, find the word that represents the molecule of energy produced in a mitochondria. And then the two students would race to find ATP and circle it or highlight it with a different color depending on who they are. So whoever has the most highlighted words in their color would win, and maybe you can give them extra credit or something like that. And then this last one over here is one that we do on the day of homeostasis. It's a grid and it has a whole bunch of, honestly, just recall questions. So what happens is everybody in the classroom puts on a name tag. So for instance, someone in the room will have the name tag of mitochondria. When students walk around with this chart, they have to find the person that matches the description. So the powerhouse of the cell is the first box. So they'll walk around the classroom and find the person who has the name tag mitochondria, and that person will sign their name in the box. So once they rotate around the room, they get all of their signatures, and then as a class you can check who was the powerhouse of the cell, and then someone will call out, me, Jimmy, and then you can double check all your answers that way. These are all just review game ideas that I used in the past that seemed to get students involved in actively trying to memorize and recall all of these new vocabulary words. All right, last thing I wanted to talk about was the end goals of Unit 2. Students need to be able to identify all the cell organelles in a picture. They need to be able to state the function on command quickly. They need to be able to compare the function to something else, and we hit that pretty hard with the hashtags and with the analogies that we use in class and on the project. We need to make sure students can identify when an organelle is malfunctioning, giving a specific situation. So students need to be able to read a situation and recognize what organelle is malfunctioning in order for that situation to occur. So if there is too much protein being created in a particular cell, they need to recognize protein. That goes with ribosome. I know the ribosome is malfunctioning here. They need to be able to state the cell theory. Like literally, they need to have it memorized, and they need to be able to recognize the part of the cell theory based on a picture. So if someone shows a student a picture of a cell dividing, they need to know that that goes with all cells come from pre-existing cells, or that particular pillar of the cell theory. And then lastly, in general, they need to be able to relate parts to a whole. Meaning, so if the vacuole is like the storage unit of a cell, then they could think in a town a storage facility would be like the vacuole of a city. So in general, students need to be able to make those connections across or make those analogies, which also is very important during the SAT later in life. And I believe that is all. If you have any questions, again, please email me at alawrence@uplifteducation.org. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have or provide any resources that I have to help you get your unit all ready to go. Thank you for listening.